Shalom, Haverim. Welcome, my fellow studiers and students of Torah. We are going to be continuing with now the second session of Soulful Psalms. Ironically, the psalm we're going to be talking about today, Psalm 2, not terribly soulful, but it gives me a chance, a little opportunity to digress into the Psalms a little bit more. We'll talk about Psalm number 2 in just a moment, but let me draw your attention to a number of interesting factoids about the Psalms. So, uh, first observation, you know that the Tanakh is broken into three sections: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. The third section is the writings, which includes everything that isn't in the Torah and is not a prophetic or historical work. Uh, Psalms is the first and longest document in the Ketuvim, and it is treated in a way that suggests that we're supposed to see it as a kind of mirror image of the Torah. It is divided into five books. It has 150 chapters, which really means that there's 150 Psalms in the collection. That's different from the Catholic collection, which has 151, but is the same as the Protestant collection because they just do what we do. And it is, I think, the third longest book in all of the biblical canon. Uh, Isaiah is the longest. I think there's a competition. I'm pretty sure it's Genesis is the second longest, and then Psalms is the third longest. It is interesting also that when almost one of the earliest mentions of the biblical canon, ironically, is found in the Gospels, describes it as thus: Jesus speaks of uh, the five books of Moses. He then speaks of the prophets, and then he says the Psalms. Now, we don't know in the first century whether he just meant the Psalms were the entirety of the third section, or Psalms was simply the way he referred to the idea that there was a third section. So, naming the first book of the collection as the entire collection is not unknown in Jewish categorical tradition. So we don't know for sure what the third collection looked like in the first century, but it is the first mention of Psalms as a authoritative or canonical book. We also recognize that the Psalms are composed probably almost over the course of 1,000 years. So we have incredibly early Psalms, like Psalm 29, that for all intents and purposes looks like a repurposed monotheistic version of a psalm to Baal, a very early psalm. And then we have psalms like 137, which is composed after the Israelites, the Jews now, return from Babylonian exile. Psalm 150, which seems to be, to wrap it all up, is probably a very, very late psalm. We don't know exactly when it was composed, but in any case, this is almost a millennium of poetry. So I just wanted to share with you some of the more interesting features, and there's more to talk about. So in the next 50 sessions, we'll continue talking. So let's talk a little bit about Psalm 2. So one of the great things about the Psalms is how much they represent a panoramic picture of the Israelites. The Psalms are, after all, composed at different times, different phases of Israelite history. And so it tells us a lot about what was going on in the context of when they were composed, even though we cannot locate any specific psalm at date it or anything like that. So Psalm 2 is a great example. The psalm we looked at, Psalm 1, I called it a wisdom psalm. It's targeted at any reader, It's meant to speak to your life, your aspirations, your hopes. Psalm 2, on the other hand, is something completely different. In the 19th century, a German scholar named Gunkel, it's fun to say, Gunkel, composed the idea that there were genres that could be distinguished within the Psalms, and he designated Psalm 2 a royal psalm. In other words, it's a psalm directed at a king, about the monarchy, something along those lines. And that's a completely different animal from what we've dealt with in Psalm 1. And this particular one is not just a royal psalm, it seems to be a coronation psalm. That is something that would have been recited or sung at the elevation or inauguration of a new king of Israel. You'll see that when I read to you some of it. It's 12 verses. It's twice as large as Psalm 1, but it's not a heck of what we moderns would call spirituality going on. It's a political psalm, but it does have some interesting things to teach us. So let me share with you this psalm, and you can get a sense of the full range of what the Psalms are about. Now, this is used in Jewish liturgy. This psalm is also, along with Psalm 1, recited on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, and it's probably chosen because it has the theme of initiating or elevating a king, which is what we're doing with God on Rosh Hashanah, is we're elevating a God as king of the world, right? And it also talks about other nations. So it gives it a universal cast. But in its original context, that's not what it's talking about. So let's listen to it. Why do the peoples assemble and the nations plot in vain? People, kings of the earth, take their stand, and the regions intrigue together against Adonai and against his anointed. Let us break the cords of their yoke and shake off their ropes from us. So, in its Gunkel would say Sitzen Leben, its living context. This is intended to forewarn any tributary or subject tribes or people under the Israelite Empire. We had a small empire for a little while under the Davidic kings, not to take the opportunity of the appointment of a new king as an excuse to rebel. All right, so it's basically an advisory. God will not tolerate you rebelling against God's anointed, Mashiach, which literally means guy dipped in oil. And that's how a king of Israel is raised up. We don't actually put a chunk of metal on his head like we do in a coronation. He is anointed to be king. So a new king is coming on. No one's really sure what his policies are going to be or how strong, weak he is. And many of these subsidiary groups, tributary groups, might see this as an opportunity to break loose, but we're being warned against that. He who is enthroned in the high heavens laughs. Adonai mocks them, and he speaks to them in anger, terrifying them in his rage. And now God speaks. But I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mount. Let me tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, that's now the king speaking, you are my son. Today I have fathered you. Ask it of me, and I will make the nations your domain, your estate the limits of the earth. So, grandly political announcements, at least from the perspective of the psalmist, Israel is the most powerful state in the world. We know that's not even slightly true, but in any case, it's the rhetoric of pleasing royalty and threatening neighbors. So the Sitzim Leben is not that uplifting or inspiring. And that's just an example of how far afoot the Psalms will go from other Psalms, which are more directed towards our soulful needs. But there are a couple of things I want to talk to you about this. The first of them is the very idea that we can, in fact, lift the Psalms out of their original context, and we can reuse them in a way that is more meaningful to us when the original context no longer matters. In this particular case, this particular psalm would be useless now that there is no Davidic king. In its original context, it just it becomes irrelevant and antiquarian. However, we find different ways to make this relevant to us. I'm going to start with, oddly enough, the Christians, and then I'm going to come back to our interpretation. So this psalm is actually quite important to Christians because they really laser focus in on the phrase talking about the newly appointed king of Israel. You are my son. I have fathered you this day, or today I have fathered you. I have a version of this in my head that's not actually right in front of me. Sorry about that. Anyway, what they're latching onto is the idea that the king, or a Mashiach, or a Messiah, is the Son of God. Which of course fits very much into their ideology, and particularly the phrase, the only begotten Son of God. And they make this psalm very useful long after its original purpose is gone, by claiming that this is a proof text for the kingship and sonship of Jesus. Now, anyone conversant with the Hebrew Bible will immediately know that there is a problem, and that is that the term Son of God simply means someone who enjoys God's favor, and you would think that a king of Israel would enjoy God's favor. The idea that this person is not born God or part of God is clear from the phrase, I have fathered you this day. In its original context, he's being inaugurated, he's being coronated. So his elevation is associated with his office, not his office associated with his God status, right? And we also know that this rhetoric of the king being the Son of God appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. We see in 2 Samuel 7:14, the prophet comes to King David and tells him, David, you're not going to be able to build my temple. That's going to fall to your son, but your son is going to be the beginning of a dynasty, house of David, and I'm going to consider him and all of his kings, all the kings afterwards, my son. I will be his son and he will be my father, or flip that. I will be his father and he will be like a son to me. So we know that when it talks about God thinking of the king of Israel as his son, it's a statement, it's a metaphor for favor. And we also know that the idea of being a son or daughter of God is not even limited in the Bible to the king. We know in Exodus that God refers to the people Israel, the entire people, as his firstborn son. So we know that this, again, is a term for being favored by the divine. We are a treasured people, and therefore we're treated like a son or a daughter. And then we see elsewhere in other Psalms where the righteous are referred to as the children of God. So what's actually happening in the course of 1,000 years in the Bible is the whole idea of being a son or daughter of God, or as Genesis says, in the image of God, which is what children are, that this whole notion is being expanded. And of course, by the time we get to the um, rabbis, we're talking about God the Father of everyone. And so the whole notion of being a son of God is radically democratized in post-biblical thought. So know that. Now, what did Jews do with a otherwise seemingly obsolete or useless psalm? This in Jewish interpretation is less about the earthly king than the divine king. God is the divine king. And when it talks about the nations, they're not talking about the local, the Jewish interpretation. We're not talking about the local neighbors who need to recognize uh, Israel's authority, but rather it's talking about how God is in fact king over all the earth. All the nations serve God, and that fits very nicely into the high holiday theme of the Israelites, or we the Jews, recoronating God each year and recognizing him as king of the world. So that just gives you a feel for how adaptable the Psalms are. Again, not anything close to a Negro spiritual. This one, it's clearly meant to serve a political purpose in its original context, but somehow people, whether it be Christians or Jews, are able to recast it in a way that is useful to them. So I'm going to stop here and realize that just because Psalm 1 made up the first session and Psalm 2 made up the second session, that doesn't mean we're going to go one by one through each of the Psalms, for the simple reason that we only have 52 sessions to do this, and there's 150 Psalms. So I'm going to be skipping around. But I thought this was a valuable one for us to reflect on, just so you can anticipate, once again, that the Psalms represent a huge spectrum of ideas. Have a great week, and we'll be talking about whatever Psalm I pick on session 3.